Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and the Rose with Thorns, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Thorns Drew Blood. The scream shattered the night like glass beneath a boot. It came from the rose garden, high, sharp, and curiously abrupt, as if strangled mid-air. By the time Hercule Poirot arrived at the estate's eastern wing, where the dew clung to the hedges like breath on glass, a trail of crimson already stained the marble path. The roses, once a radiant white, were now stained with a color far less innocent. "A woman does not cry out like that," Poirot murmured, his patent leather shoes crunching softly over gravel. "Unless she has seen death or caused it." Lady Emmeline Hargrave stood frozen beneath the trellis, one gloved hand pressed to her mouth. Her dress, an ivory silk affair more suited for tea than tragedy, was splattered with blood across the left sleeve. But it was not hers. At her feet, slumped grotesquely among the roses, lay the body of Howard Lytton, her private secretary. His head had tilted unnaturally to one side, a rivulet of blood trickling from a puncture wound in his neck. His eyes, wide open, stared toward the sky in perpetual astonishment. The wound was precise, almost too precise, and clutched in his lifeless fist was a single rose, its stem thick with thorns, its petals bruised by the tightness of his grip. Inspector Japp, summoned hastily from London, arrived breathless and unconvinced. "A fall onto the roses," he scoffed. "Drunk, likely, clumsy, foolish, unlucky." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, mon ami, a fall, you say? Then how do you explain the angle of the wound, or the fact that none of the thorns bear his blood, except one, freshly snipped, lying a foot away from the bush? None. This was no fall. It was a message, masked in elegance. And that," he added softly, kneeling beside the corpse, "is always dangerous." The Hargrave estate, Briarcliff Hall, loomed behind them. A mansion, as cold and ancient as its name suggested. Candlelight flickered from its stained glass windows. Somewhere within, a grandfather clock struck midnight. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Midnight always marked a threshold, a moment when truth, if one was paying close enough attention, often chose to whisper. Three individuals hovered in the periphery, each pretending not to watch Poirot, each too tense for comfort. The first was Miles Hargrave, the lady's distant cousin and heir to her dwindling fortune. Dressed in a charcoal suit too elegant for a countryside weekend, his polished demeanor could not conceal the nervous tick of his jaw. "Tragic," he murmured, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. Howard was a quiet fellow, not the sort to find trouble. "Quiet men," Poirot replied without looking at him, "sometimes harbor the loudest secrets." The second was Isadora Venn, the lady's live-in companion and self-professed herbalist. A woman of sharp cheekbones and sharper glances, she stood apart from the others, her arms crossed beneath a cashmere shawl. The scent of lavender clung to her like a warning. "That rose," she said softly, "is from the Paracelsus breed. Rare. Bred to look beautiful, but its thorns, Well, they were once used in poisons. You bleed before you feel. And yet, Poirot said gently, you speak of it as though you admire its cruelty. The third, and perhaps most visibly shaken, was Reverend Paul Ainsley, a widower and frequent guest at the hall. His hands were folded in front of him, lips pressed into silent prayer. But Poirot's gaze caught the fine tremble in his shoulders. The Lord sees all, the Reverend said finally, as if unprompted. He will punish the wicked. Poirot turned. Indeed. But until then, it falls to lesser men, such as myself, to unearth them. In the drawing room, Poirot conducted interviews beneath the watchful eyes of ancestral portraits. Lady Emilienne wept only once, when, recalling Howard's loyalty, he wrote all my letters, you understand, knew all my schedules. He was more than a secretary, he was constant. Was he in love with you, madame? Poirot asked quietly. The fire snapped. She did not answer. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Silence in such moments was as telling as confession. Upstairs, Howard's bedroom revealed its own story. A cluttered desk, a locked drawer hastily broken, and a bundle of letters hidden behind a false panel. Each was written in a trembling hand, signed only R. One, dated 2 weeks prior, read, If you breathe a word of what you saw that night, not even the roses will mourn you. Ah, Poirot whispered, examining the ink. Now we begin to dig beneath the soil. Act 2 began with the unraveling of facades. Japp pursued the inheritance angle with gusto, suspecting Miles, who stood to gain significantly should Emilienne fall into disgrace or despair. But Poirot was not so easily drawn. He focused instead on a single strand of wool found near the rosebush, red like the shawl worn by Isidora. She denied ever being in the garden that evening. Poirot said nothing. That evening, while a storm rolled over the moors like a beast stalking prey, Poirot took a walk alone through the garden. Lightning illuminated the thorns. He paused beside the Paracelsus rose. A thorn, he noticed, had been clipped with surgical precision. Back in the library, he confronted Reverend Ainsley. You quoted the Psalms tonight, did you not? The Lord will punish the wicked. But you misquoted the verse. The real line reads, The Lord will preserve the righteous. An interesting substitution. A Freudian lapse, perhaps? The Reverend's eyes darkened. You have no idea what that boy was capable of. Poirot blinked. Then enlighten me. That night, another scream. This time from Isidora's room. She was not dead, but on her mirror, scrawled in lipstick, were the words, You took the thorns, now I'll take you. The lipstick belonged to Emilienne. But Emilienne swore it had gone missing days ago. Poirot's mind raced. Red herring. The attempt on Isidora was not a crime of rage, it was staged, sloppy, theatrical, and desperate, and someone wanted her silenced before she could say more. Poirot gathered everyone the next evening in the conservatory. The storm had passed, but tension remained, like static in the air. He began, as always, with quiet precision. Howard Lytton was not an innocent man, but he was not blackmailing Lady Emilienne, as many of you suspected. No, his letters, those from R, were not from a lover or an enemy. They were confessions. He had seen something that terrified him. Poirot turned to Isidora. You knew what he saw, did you not? She flinched. I suspected. Poirot gestured. Then I beg you, share it with the room. Her voice was brittle. The night of the charity gala last month. He saw someone leave Emilienne's study with a stack of forged documents, papers that could alter the estate's legal ownership. He followed them into the garden. He saw their face. Poirot turned to Miles. "That face was yours." Miles dropped his cigarette. "I confronted him," Miles muttered. "I asked him to keep quiet. He wouldn't. Said he'd tell Emilienne everything." Poirot raised a brow. "So you killed him with a rose?" "No," Miles snapped. "I confronted him with threats? Yes. But I didn't kill him." Poirot turned. "And you didn't." He walked to the Reverend, whose face had drained of all color. "You followed Howard after the argument. You found him alone, shaken, and you offered comfort. You even offered prayer. But when he turned his back," Poirot produced the final piece of evidence, a thin steel pin with a thorn attached to it. This Reverend was found beneath the bush, a makeshift weapon, disguised as nature. The Reverend crumbled. He was going to destroy everything. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, the real reason. The Reverend had been misusing the trust of the church, funneling donations into speculative investments. Howard had discovered it by accident when organizing the charity accounts. He folded his hands. "You believed yourself righteous. You believed the boy's death was divine justice. But it was only murder." The Reverend was led away, shaking, whispering scripture under his breath. Afterward, Poirot stood beneath the rose arch once more, the thorns now dewed with fresh rain. "Even the most beautiful rose," he murmured, "when raised in poisoned soil, will grow cruel." He turned to Jap, who was still stunned. "There was one clue above all, mon ami." The rose in Howard's hand, not a reflex, but a warning. He held it, even as he died, to tell us. Beauty concealed the weapon. A metaphor, yes, but also, quite literally, the truth. Poirot looked back once more at the path where blood had stained the earth. "Ah, Hastings," he murmured to no one. "How often it is that death blooms where vanity takes root." And with that, he walked into the morning fog, while behind him the roses swayed, silent and far too red. Chapter 2. A Whisper Beneath the Petals. The petals moved when there was no wind. A single white rose trembled on its stem, not from breeze, but as if something beneath the soil had stirred. The gardener swore he'd seen it, just after midnight, under the hazy shimmer of the moonlight. A rustle, a whisper, then stillness. By morning, the rose had wilted unnaturally, as though it had aged 20 years overnight. Poirot stood above it now, the sharp scent of damp earth, rising to meet his nostrils, his gloved fingers gently parting the surrounding thorns. The bloom was not simply dead, it had been poisoned. Its roots showed burn marks, its petals curled black at the edges. Murder had returned to Briarcliff Hall, this time not with a scream, but a whisper. The household remained shaken after the death of Howard Lytton. And yet, as Poirot had come to learn, in the wake of violence, human nature reveals itself most starkly. Lady Emilienne had withdrawn into herself, her movements now restrained and ceremonial. She took to pruning roses herself, a task once beneath her, saying little, her hands trembling ever so slightly at the snip of every thorn. Poirot watched her silently that morning. The mind, he thought, can numb the heart, but the hands, they betray every ghost. A new figure entered the circle of suspicion. Lydia Vale, the estate's archivist, called upon to catalogue and safeguard Lady Emilienne's growing collection of heirlooms. She was quiet, meticulous, and observant to the point of discomfort. Her spectacles glinted in the candlelight at odd angles, and her fingers bore the stains of ink and rose oil. She arrived 2 days after the murder, but Poirot noticed something that troubled him. She had entered the rose garden her first night, long before she had been officially introduced. When asked, she claimed to be looking for the servants' quarters. Curious, Poirot mused aloud to Japp later, how often people lose their way into secrets they were never meant to find. Poirot examined the poisoned bloom again at sunrise. He'd had it removed with care, roots, soil and all, and kept it in a sealed container. The murder weapon, he said, tapping the glass with a silver pen, is not always a blade. Sometimes it is silence, sometimes a flower. The soil, he observed, had a faint bluish sheen, a rare compound, arsenical, but not commonly sold. Only one person in the house had access to such chemicals. Isadora, then, the herbalist, whose collection of tinctures and botanical extracts now resembled a war cabinet more than an apothecary. She met Poirot's inquiries with indignant restraint. "I treat ailments," she said, her voice like crushed mint. "I do not cause them." "But you also know how to kill pain," he countered, "and to kill without pain." He left her with that thought and proceeded to explore Howard's personal effects once more. Something had bothered him about Howard's pocket watch, a fine Swiss piece, but the glass was scratched deeply on the inside of the lid, as though something had been repeatedly hidden or placed there. A small indentation inside the lining gave Poirot pause. He took a magnifying lens from his coat. A faint imprint, so faint it was almost imagined, of a tiny rose petal. "Symbolic," he whispered, "or practical." Miles Hargrave, the air with debts mounting like storm clouds, was growing increasingly restless. Poirot noted the twitch in his hand when the subject of Lydia Vale was mentioned. They pretended not to know each other, but Poirot had overheard a whispered conversation in the hallway the night before. Low, breathless, filled with resentment. "You said it was done," Miles had hissed. "I should not even be here." "It isn't finished," Lydia had replied. "Not until the whisper is silenced." Japp had dismissed it as lovers' quarrel, but Poirot's mind latched onto a different word. Whisper. That evening, a letter arrived. It bore no seal, no handwriting, only a pressed rose, this time blackened, dry, and wrapped in a ribbon of crimson silk. Inside, a single phrase typed in block letters. He knew the roots. Poirot sat in his chamber, the fire casting long, restless shadows. "Ah," he muttered to himself, "they grow bolder." But desperation, it does not come from guilt, it comes from fear. And fear, he knew, was the soil from which murder grows best. Act 2 began not with another death, but with the unearthing of a truth long buried beneath both roses and reputation. Poirot had the entire garden mapped and measured. The Paracelsus roses had been imported 5 years ago, bred from a line known for their toxic properties. But there were gaps in the records. The shipment numbers didn't match. One crate had gone unaccounted for. Poirot suspected it had been buried, literally hidden not because of its beauty, but because of what lay with it. He requested a night excavation. As thunder rolled and lightning peeled the sky like paper, the groundsman dug 2 feet, 3, then the dull clang of metal. A small box, rusted at the hinges, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a ledger. And inside that, records of forged estate transactions, payouts, and an anonymous signature. V. Poirot's eyes flashed. Not just murder, blackmail, cover-up, and betrayal. He now had motive, but not yet the killer. Lydia Vale was called in to examine the ledger. Her reaction was near perfect, but Poirot noted the barest shift in her breathing, the flicker of recognition too quickly masked. "You recognize this signature?" he asked. She hesitated. "It appears stylized. A flourish. Could be anyone." "Could it?" Poirot held her gaze. "Because it matches precisely the inscription found inside the first edition book you gifted to Miles Hargrave last Christmas." Silence. Then, "I only copied what he told me to write." A crack. Not a confession, but a fracture. Later that evening, Lydia was attacked. She had gone to the garden again, foolishly or bravely, and returned with a gash across her forearm, and a whispering voice burned into her memory. "Stay away from the petals." Miles insisted he had been playing cards with Isadora when it happened. Isadora confirmed it, too quickly, too completely. Poirot knew one of them was lying. Perhaps both. The final twist came not with blood, but with music. Poirot, ever meticulous, had noted the strange habits of the estate's piano tuner, Mr. Thorn, who arrived weekly, though the piano had not been played in months. An odd man, aged, blind in one eye, and with an ear tuned to deceit. That day, as Poirot questioned him, he said simply, "There's a whisper in the east wall of the Rose Salon. Behind the painting. Been there since the new flowers came." They moved the painting. Behind it, a listening device, primitive, wired through the wall, connected to a gramophone player and speaker system hidden in the floorboards beneath the rose garden. Poirot played the tape. Voices, Howard and someone else, Miles. But then a third voice joined, and it was female. Lydia. They were planning something, not murder, exposure. "We can't let her keep this place," Lydia's voice said. She bought it with silence. The truth came tumbling out like overripe fruit. Lady Emilienne had once been involved in an estate scandal, an accident long ago, covered up with bribes and silence. Howard found the ledgers. Lydia wanted justice. Miles wanted money. But someone wanted to bury the past, at all costs. That someone was Isadora. She had been there from the beginning, not simply as companion, but as witness to the original scandal. She had used her knowledge to control Emilienne, to manipulate Howard, and when the ledger was unearthed again, she had acted. She poisoned the rose to send a message. She arranged the whispering voices in the garden to create paranoia. And when it failed, she attacked Lydia to keep her quiet. Poirot revealed it all in the Rose Salon, with the walls listening one last time. Isadora crumbled, not from guilt, but exhaustion. "You think justice matters here?" she said, her voice low. "This house is built on secrets. The roses only bloom because we feed them lies." As she was taken away, Poirot stood alone in the garden, the moonlight painting silver upon thorns. "Murder," he whispered, "does not always cry out. Sometimes it murmurs. It waits. It grows among the petals." And he looked to the one rose that had wilted before all others. "The dead do not whisper, Hastings, but the guilty, they never stop." Chapter 3. The gardener vanished at dawn. It was the sound of shears hitting stone that woke the house. A sharp clang, metal against marble, then silence. When the maid came to open the conservatory doors at first light, she found the shears abandoned on the floor, wet with dew and something far more sinister, blood. A trail of red drops led through the rose garden, past the fountain with the broken cherub, and vanished near the edge of the East Woods. But of Thomas Gray, the gardener, there was no sign, not a footstep, not a cry. It was as though the man had been swallowed whole by the morning itself. Hercule Poirot stared at the abandoned shears, his eyes narrowing. "One does not vanish, mademoiselle," he told the trembling maid. "Not unless one desires it, or is made to." Gray had worked at Briarcliff Hall for 8 years. Quiet, meticulous, and fiercely private, he had been the caretaker of the estate's famed rose garden, a place where every bloom had been planted under his hand. Lady Emilienne once said, "He spoke more to flowers than people." And yet days before his disappearance, Poirot had noticed a change. The man had become distracted, often looking over his shoulder as if the very shadows had grown teeth. He had avoided Isidora Venn, passed Lydia Vale without a word, and had nearly dropped a crate of soil when Miles Hargrave approached him from behind. Fear, Poirot had thought at the time, it grows faster than weeds. Now, with the garden in quiet mourning and Gray's gloves still damp on the bench, Poirot retraced his steps from the night before. The soil near the arbor had been freshly turned, not with the symmetry Gray was known for, but hurriedly, almost frantically. A patch had been covered with dead leaves, poorly disguised. Poirot brushed them aside and found something that made his heart pause. A piece of cloth, torn, deep red, identical in shade to the gardener's uniform jacket. Beneath it, the soil had been loosened. Digging gently with his cane, Poirot unearthed a small wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread. It bore no lock, only a simple brass hinge. Inside, dried petals, yellowed papers, and a photograph. The photograph showed 2 men. One was Gray, younger, bearded, eyes suspicious of the lens. The other was unfamiliar, lean, scarred, and staring directly at the camera with an expression that held no warmth. The back of the photo was marked with a single word, Redfern. Poirot closed the box carefully. "Ah," he whispered, "the ghosts of the past, they do not die. They garden themselves in silence." Lady Emilienne denied knowing anything of the man in the photograph. Thomas never spoke of family, she insisted. He lived in the East Wing, kept mostly to himself. I trusted him with everything. He had the keys to the apothecary, the garden shed, even the wine cellar. "A man trusted with keys," Poirot replied, "can either be your greatest ally or your final undoing." Miles Hargrave scoffed at the drama of it all. "The man probably ran off, heard the police were sniffing about the murder, and bolted. I'd do the same if I had a scandal to hide." "And do you?" Poirot asked softly. Miles smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Poirot did know, at least partially. Miles had been seen entering the apothecary late the night before Howard Lytton's death. Isidora had seen him. Lydia had said nothing. Poirot wondered which one had more to hide. Isidora, with her bottles and secrets, or Lydia, whose knowledge of human nature was always masked behind ink-stained fingers and unreadable glances. Act 2 began with the search. The local constables were called to comb the estate. The East Woods were turned over. The gardener's quarters searched. Inside, Poirot found 2 curious things. First, a book on medicinal flora, its margins lined with cryptic notes, some in Latin. Second, a pair of boots, freshly cleaned, but with a small clump of dried clay caught in the laces. That clay, Poirot knew, did not come from the gardens of Briarcliff. It was darker, denser, It belonged to the marsh fields beyond the chapel. Why, then, had Gray been there? That night, Poirot visited the chapel. He brought no lantern, trusting the moonlight and his instincts. The door creaked with a sorrowful groan. Dust motes floated like ghosts in the air. At the altar, a small candle had been recently lit and extinguished. He smelled the wax, still warm. Someone had been there less than an hour ago. Beneath the altar was a trap door, ancient and rotted. He lifted it with care and found stairs leading down into the crypt. And there, buried beneath old prayer scrolls and a cracked statue of St. Jude, lay a body. Not Gray, not yet, but the man from the photograph, Redfern. His face now pale and twisted, but unmistakable. The cause of death was clear, a slit throat, precise and clean, and placed upon his chest a single rose, thornless, artificial. Poirot returned to the hall with the box, the photo, and news of the corpse. He summoned the three most likely suspects. Isidora Venn, pale as bone. "I told you," she whispered. "These grounds are cursed. That man, Gray, he brought it with him. The moment he started planting those roses, something changed." "You speak of evil, madame," Poirot said calmly. "But evil, I find, wears no costume. It wears hands and words and cleverness." Lydia Vale tried to remain composed, but Poirot could see the truth tugging at her expression like a seam unraveling. "I knew Redfern," she admitted finally. "Years ago, he ran a botanic black market, rare plants, smuggling. Gray was once his apprentice, but Gray left after Redfern. Hurt someone." "Someone you knew?" Poirot asked. Lydia looked away. "Someone I loved." Miles, when confronted, scoffed again. "So what?" The gardener knew criminals. "Is that worth all this trouble? Maybe he killed Redfern. Maybe he ran. None of it changes what's important." "And what is important, monsieur?" Poirot asked. "That my aunt's estate is rotting from the inside, and you're too busy following ghosts to see it." Poirot said nothing, but inside, the pieces clicked. The twist came, as they always do, with the simplest lie. A housemaid, polishing the banisters that afternoon, mentioned something Poirot had not heard before. "Strangest thing, sir. Mr. Gray had a visitor 3 days ago, a woman. She brought him something, a parcel, said it was urgent, but when I asked who she was, she just smiled and said, 'Tell him the past has come due.'" "Describe her," Poirot said. The maid paused, wore gloves, black dress, short hair, walked like she owned the place. Poirot already knew. Later that night, he knocked on Lydia's chamber door. She greeted him with restraint. He held up the photograph. "You told me you knew Redfern, but you did not tell me you were the one he hurt, nor that Gray saved you, nor that the parcel you delivered 3 days ago contained poison." Her eyes fluttered, but she did not break. Poirot stepped closer. "You see, I examined the contents of Gray's hidden box. There was a vial tucked behind the photograph, the same compound that killed the rose in the garden. You brought it to him. You wanted him to use it." Lydia folded. "He was supposed to give it to Redfern, poison him, end him. But something went wrong. He couldn't do it. He killed Redfern with a knife instead," Poirot finished, "and fled." "Not fled," Lydia whispered. "He said he'd bury the past where it couldn't be found, that he'd vanish like the petals after frost. He meant to end everything." "Except the lies," Poirot said softly. "Those, mademoiselle, always bloom again. They found Gray's body, the next morning in the marshes, curled beneath the roots of an old tree. He had drowned himself. In his pocket, a note, dry in a sealed pouch. "Forgive me. I feared the rose would bleed again." Later, Poirot walked alone in the garden, the wind rustling the thorns gently. Japp joined him, hands in pockets. "Another case," Japp muttered. "All for a dead man and a few dried petals." Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. All for the truth, for memory, for justice not written in courtrooms but in conscience." He plucked a rose. Its thorn pricked his glove. "The gardener did not vanish," Poirot murmured. "He was buried, beneath his own guilt." And as the wind picked up and the sun began to rise, Poirot let the rose fall to the earth, its petals scattering like whispers into the morning mist. Chapter 4. Poison in the Perfume. She collapsed in the hallway with a faint sigh, as if she'd been kissed by death itself. The perfume bottle lay shattered beside her, its glass glinting under the chandelier like fangs. The scent lingered in the air, floral, sweet, with an afternote so sharp it made the eyes water. It was a fragrance that seemed to bloom as she died. Her final breath was soft, almost serene. But the terror in her eyes, that was unmistakable. Lady Emilienne Hargrave had not screamed. She had not even gasped. She had simply stepped into the hallway at dusk, lifted the crystal flacon to her throat, and collapsed moments later, the hem of her dress soaked in the scent of roses. And something far deadlier. Poirot stood in the doorway moments later, his gaze falling first to the glass, then to the stillness of her hand. "A lady's perfume," he murmured, "should never make her weep. But this, ah mon Dieu, this was not a fragrance, it was a murder in disguise." He crouched carefully beside the body, inspecting the shattered remnants of the perfume bottle with delicate precision. A thin strand of rose-pink liquid traced its way across the marble tiles, curling like a question mark. A message, he thought. But to whom was it addressed? Dr. Bramley, the estate physician, arrived in haste and confirmed the obvious. Heart failure, likely induced by toxin, plant-based, immediate onset, death within seconds. He removed his gloves with solemn efficiency, though Poirot did not miss the tiny flecks of dried pollen on the man's sleeve. "Tell me, doctor," Poirot asked gently, "do you often examine flowers before examining corpses?" The doctor smiled, tight-lipped. "I was in the greenhouse when I heard the fall. It's why I arrived so quickly." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but speed, mon ami, is not always the mark of innocence. Sometimes it is the mark of preparation." The estate fell into chaos. Emilienne's sudden death rattled every room, every hallway, every silence. The staff whispered. The guests turned cold. The scent of that perfume, Rosa Nuit, had once been her signature. It now hung over the house like a curse. Poirot began the second act of his inquiry with methodical grace. He returned to the source, the dressing table in Emilienne's chamber. 4 bottles stood there, one for morning, one for evening, one gifted by a distant niece, and one, Rosa Nuit, gifted last week. That one was missing its cap. Its label was hand-inked. The seal was broken. He lifted the remnants of a wax stamp from the edge of the bottle. Not the Hargrave crest, but a different one entirely. "Un fleur dans la nuit," it read. Poirot closed his eyes. A flower in the night, yes, but some flowers only bloom for the dead. 3 suspects emerged with unsettling clarity. The first, Isadora Venn, herbalist and resident apothecary. She had access to everything botanical within 50 miles of the estate. She had once concocted sleeping powders for Lady Emilienne, and she had been overheard quarrelling with her in the Rose Salon just 2 days prior. "You think I don't know what's in your will?" she had whispered. "You think you can use me until the very end and leave me nothing?" The second, Dr. Bramley himself. A man whose care had always appeared attentive, perhaps too attentive. Rumours among the staff suggested he had once been more than a physician to Lady Emilienne, that he had written her poetry, that she had rejected him and cut him from her new will only last week. The third, Lydia Vale, the archivist. She had meticulously catalogued Lady Emilienne's estate, including the perfume collection. But what caught Poirot's attention was a journal entry buried deep in one of her ledgers. "R.N. arrives Thursday. Must secure it before the ceremony." When questioned, Lydia claimed the note referred to a shipment of roses for the anniversary gala, but Poirot found no order, no receipts, and no roses of that name in the garden. "R.N., he thought. Rosa Nuit. The name of the poison, or the name of the plan?" The first twist revealed itself in the coroner's report. The perfume had been laced with aconitine, a deadly toxin derived from monkshood, not easily absorbed through the skin, but easily fatal if inhaled. A perfect vehicle for murder, hidden in plain scent. Poirot examined the broken glass again, this time under a jeweler's loupe. A faint groove, almost imperceptible, had been etched into the inside rim. A thin filament had been tucked there, cotton, soaked in toxin, designed to release the scent only when the bottle was tilted and pressed. "Not a spontaneous act," Poirot murmured. "A device, built by someone who understood both chemistry and her habits." That night, as thunder rolled and candlelight flickered in the grand dining hall, Poirot gathered the household once more. The fire snapped. The air was thick with anticipation and something else, fear. He began with Isadora. "You had motive. You were cut from the will. You had access to monkshood. You knew the effect, but you did not kill Lady Emilienne." She blinked. "How do you know?" "Because," Poirot said, "you left the greenhouse door ajar. And Isadora, you never leave your precious herbs to the frost. You were rattled, but not calculating." He turned to Lydia. "You catalogued her perfumes. You made a note of Rosa Nuit, but you are meticulous, obsessed with dates, with order, with preservation. You would never risk shattering a bottle whose provenance you wished to archive." His gaze settled on Dr. Bramley. "You, Doctor, were seen in the greenhouse. You had the expertise, the motive. You had once written her sonnets, but you also had a peculiar relationship with death. You viewed it as mercy." Poirot paced slowly. "But no, it was none of you." A beat. The tension rippled like silk, torn in silence. He stepped to the sideboard and lifted a silver serving tray. Beneath it, a note. Folded once, tucked neatly behind a decanter, he read it aloud. "If she won't name me, she will not name anyone." "Not a threat," Poirot said. "A promise, written not in hatred, but in sorrow." He turned and faced Miles Hargrave. Miles had said nothing all evening, had sat in the corner, drinking slowly, jaw tense. "You wanted the estate," Poirot said. "You needed it, but you knew Emilienne would never name you sole heir. You were her mistake, the scandal never spoken. Her son, illegitimate, forgotten, you were going to be cut off completely. And so, you made sure her voice was silenced, with scent. Miles stood, eyes dark. She never even looked at me like I was hers. She never said it, Poirot agreed. But her silence condemned you just the same. Miles did not resist as the constables took him. He only said, quietly, "It was her favorite perfume. I wanted her to die with something she loved." Poirot stood alone in the hallway after they left. He stared at the spot where Emilienne had fallen. The scent of Rosa Nuit had finally faded. He whispered to the empty corridor, "Ah, but you see, madame, love, when it festers, does not perfume the air. It poisons it." And with that, he walked away, leaving only silence behind. Chapter 5. A note in crimson ink. The note was found on the piano, folded once, its surface still damp from a single tear, or perhaps from the ink itself, which had bled like a wound onto the cream-colored paper. No envelope, no signature, just 7 sharp, slanted words scrawled in crimson. "You will pay for what bloomed." The color was not quite red, not quite brown, something older, dried, almost human. And though no one said it aloud, they all feared the same thought. It was blood. Poirot studied it without touching, his gloved fingers hovering just inches above the page. "Not a threat," he said softly, "but a judgment, and a very personal one." It had been placed precisely, centered, upright, on the grand piano in the drawing room. The lid was still raised from the night before, when Lydia Vale had played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor after dinner, her fingers trembling slightly during the final notes. It was she who had first discovered the note at dawn when she returned to practice. Her scream was muffled, restrained, more shock than horror. But her face, pale and drawn, told the rest of the story. The timing was deliberate. The drawing room remained locked every night. Only 5 people held keys. The note had not been there at midnight. By morning it had arrived, silent as breath, red as guilt. Poirot stared at it a moment longer, then turned to Inspector Japp, who was now crouching beside the bench, inspecting the ivory keys. "No sign of forced entry," Japp said. "No footprints. Whoever left it either had a key or wings." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then let us consider the psychology, not the intrusion. This is not merely a message, it is a performance, one designed to draw attention, to shift fear." Japp raised an eyebrow. "You think it's connected to Lady Emilienne's death?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the chandelier above, whose crystals refracted the morning light into fractured prisms. "Oui, mon ami, I believe the perfume may have killed her, but this note is the next act of the same play." Act 1 unfolded that morning with unsettling elegance. A new tension had gripped Briarcliff Hall like ivy wrapping a crumbling wall. Everyone's steps were quieter. Everyone's eyes were sharper. The mourning period for Lady Emilienne had barely begun, yet now whispers returned in her absence. And from those whispers, suspicion bloomed like rot. Poirot observed each resident with his usual quiet calculation. Lydia Vale had grown paler, more distracted. She claimed to be writing Emilienne's memoirs, an archival tribute, but Poirot noticed her quill had no ink blotter nearby. She was writing, yes, but hiding more than she recorded. Miles Hargrave, Emilienne's estranged nephew, had become unusually attentive, not out of grief, but as if he feared the walls might start speaking. Poirot noted that his shoes were recently polished unusual for Miles, who rarely cared for appearances. And yet, they had no dust, no trace of the garden's soil, though he claimed to have spent the entire morning walking the grounds. Isadora Venn, meanwhile, was silent. Too silent. Her greenhouse remained locked. She had not been seen near the rose garden since Emilienne's death. But Poirot knew from his brief visit earlier that morning that one of her favorite tinctures, rosewood oil infused with clove, had vanished from her apothecary shelf. And that very scent had faintly lingered in the drawing-room when the note was discovered. A twist came, not with the next death, but with a memory, a clue buried in ink and time. Poirot returned to Emilienne's writing desk, where she had stored old letters. Most had been catalogued by Lydia, but one had been overlooked, pressed between two heavy volumes on botanical folklore. It bore no date, but its contents were unmistakable. It was a confession, or the beginning of one. I should never have planted the rose, not here, not on this land. It bloomed too easily, and once it did, everything changed. I saw his eyes that night. I knew what he would become. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched Lady Emilienne's journals. Planted the rose, Poirot whispered. Not metaphor, literal. He returned to the rose garden with Jap, their boots crunching over brittle stems. In the northeast corner, just beneath the sundial, Poirot pointed to a single bush with darkened petals. This one, he said, it bloomed too early this season. See how the soil around it has been turned recently? They dug 3 feet, 4, then the edge of a small metal tin. Inside, a dried rose, blackened by age, and another note. This one was different, typewritten, carefully folded, and signed with a single letter. A. I watched him bury it. I said nothing. We were complicit, but she must not be allowed to forget. She made us all accomplices. The plot twisted again. A, Poirot murmured. Not a name. An initial, but not one we know yet. Later that evening, as candlelight flickered against the walls and a storm began to grumble in the distance, Poirot gathered the suspects in the drawing room. Rain tapped lightly against the stained glass windows, as if the night itself was listening. I must ask, he began, about handwriting. Madame Vale, you use a fountain pen with crimson ink. Why? She hesitated. Lady Emilienne preferred it. Said it looked like passion on paper. Poirot turned to Miles. And you, monsieur, your boots? You walked the garden this morning, did you not? He blinked. Yes. But they are clean. Not a trace of dirt. Miles shrugged. I brushed them off. Poirot turned to Isadora. And your tinctures? You are missing one. Rosewood oil. Why? She glanced at the fire. I used it in a salve. For my wrists. You did not mention this. Earlier, he said calmly. I didn't think it mattered. But everything, madame, he said softly, matters. Then came the final act, the unraveling. Poirot stepped to the piano and placed the original note beside a fresh sheet of paper. He handed both to Jap. You will note the ink is not from a common pen. It is iron gall ink, historically used in formal documents, now rare, but Lady Emilienne kept it for special occasions. He gestured toward a small, nearly empty bottle on her desk, and someone used it the night before she died. He turned to Lydia. You, madame, have an excellent memory for ink. You catalogued every letter in this house, but there is one letter missing, the one Emilienne wrote the night before she died. It was a reply to someone she feared. Lydia's eyes widened. How do you know that? Poirot held up a piece of torn blotting paper. Because you left the imprint beneath the drawer lining. A reply written not in love, but in refusal. To whom? Japp asked. Poirot turned. To Miles. Gasps rippled through the room. She wrote to tell him the truth, that she was removing him entirely from her will, that she had discovered he forged her signature on the property documents last spring, that he would not inherit anything. He stepped closer. And so he wrote a message. Not to her, but to all of us. A note in crimson ink, designed to frighten, to shift suspicion, and to hide his guilt. Miles stood frozen, his breath shallow. I didn't write the note, he said quietly. No? Poirot smiled sadly. Then why is your typewriter missing? It's achy. Miles flinched. You thought it would go unnoticed, Poirot continued. But I saw the indentation on the ribbon. You typed the second message, the one in the garden. You wanted us to believe it came from someone else. Someone still alive. Someone seeking vengeance. But you were the vengeance, monsieur. And your weapon was ink. Japp stepped forward. Miles did not run. After the constables had taken him, Poirot stood alone before the fire. The note still rested on the piano, the ink drying into the wood beneath. Crimson, he murmured, is the color of roses, yes, but also of secrets too long buried. And like ink, Monsieur Hastings, they always find a way to seep through. Chapter 6. The Widow Who Never Cried. She wore black, but her eyes were dry. Not a single tear had fallen. Not at the funeral, not when they lowered the coffin, not even when the bell tolled for the man she had shared a bed with for 16 years. The village whispered, as villages always do, but none dared speak their thoughts aloud, that the widow's grief was too polished, too rehearsed. And Hercule Poirot, standing quietly by the edge of the grave beneath a sky choked with clouds, thought precisely the same. Ah, he mused, mourning Hastings is not always worn on the face. Sometimes it is a costume, and other times an alibi. The deceased, one Charles Armitage, was a man of note in Briarcliff society, a retired banker with a history as precise and predictable as the ledgers he used to balance. The circumstances of his death had been, at first glance, rather mundane. A stroke, sudden and violent, while reading in his study. His wife, Madeline Armitage, had discovered him slumped forward in the armchair, spectacles cracked, a faint line of blood beneath his ear. A doctor was summoned, the death certified, and preparations were made with unusual efficiency. Too unusual. Poirot, having recently concluded his affairs at Briarcliff Hall, had been invited to the funeral out of courtesy. Lady Emilienne had once been acquainted with the Armitages. Yet, as the casket descended, and Madeline turned to greet the mourners with an air more befitting, yea, hostess than a widow, Poirot knew at once. Something was profoundly wrong. Act 1 began that very evening in the drawing-room of the Armitage estate, a room too tidy, too curated, with firelight flickering across marble statues and portraits that seemed to watch. Poirot found himself served tea by a maid who kept glancing over her shoulder, and he watched as Madeleine poured her own cup with a steady hand. My husband was a man of order, she said. Everything in its place. He would have hated the chaos of this week. And yet, Poirot replied, death, madame, is the greatest disorder of all. She smiled thinly. Yes, it is. There was no scent of grief about her, no tremble in the voice, no lost gazes into empty space. Poirot noted the single ring on her finger, worn but recently polished, and beside her on the side table, a book with a bookmark tucked in exactly at page 153. A false marker, he suspected. It had been placed for effect, not use. The room was thick with tension beneath the silence. Entering next was Gerald Finch, the Armitages' family solicitor. Finch was lean, severe, with a mouth that rarely opened fully, and a voice that dropped syllables like they were too expensive to pronounce. He confirmed the will had not changed in over 3 years. "Everything goes to Mrs. Armitage," he said simply. "No surprises." Charles was a predictable man. Poirot nodded. "And yet he died with no warning. How curious." Finch blinked. "Strokes can happen to anyone." "But his doctor," Poirot said, "noted his heart was sound. No history of hypertension, no aneurysms. Curious again, n'est-ce pas?" Finch hesitated. "What are you implying?" Poirot only smiled. By the second act, suspicion had begun to flower, quietly and unexpectedly. Poirot examined Charles's study and found what he expected: order, symmetry, neatness. But near the armchair where he had died was something that did not belong. A coaster, slightly misaligned, and beneath it, the faintest ring of condensation. The maid, when questioned, swore that no drinks had been served that evening. No tea, no brandy. And yet the ring was fresh, left by something cold. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The mystery deepened when he discovered a second inconsistency. In the waste bin, buried beneath envelopes and receipts, was the torn corner of a letter, written in Charles's hand. Only a few words were legible. "Can no longer protect her. She knows." Poirot retrieved it carefully and stared at the ink. Fresh, not more than 3 days old. Later, he visited the village apothecary, where he inquired about recent purchases made by the Armitages. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a twitchy memory, recalled one detail. "Mrs. Armitage bought belladonna root, said it was for migraines. Odd that she never bought anything before." Poirot made a mental note: belladonna, a poison that could mimic stroke. In small doses, symptoms would align: blurred vision, dizziness, disorientation. In large doses, death. His next visit was to Helen Mertry, a neighbor and close friend of Madeline's. Helen was gentle, observant, and unguarded enough to offer what others concealed. Over tea, she confessed, Charles had grown paranoid. He'd stopped walking the gardens at night, said he saw someone watching the house. "Did he say who?" Helen shook her head. "No, but once he mentioned the name Weatherby. Do you know it?" Poirot did not. Not yet. It was only when he returned to the estate that the second twist revealed itself. He found, hidden behind the books in the study, a sealed envelope addressed not to Madeline, but to Finch. Inside, a second will, dated just 2 weeks prior. Its contents changed everything. In it, Charles left a portion of his estate to someone else, Eleanor Weatherby, a name that had vanished from family record 15 years ago. A former maid, dismissed under scandal, the same year Madeline had miscarried, or so she claimed. Poirot now saw the full web beginning to tighten. Eleanor Weatherby was not simply a maid. She had been something more. Charles's mistress, perhaps, or his illegitimate daughter's mother. And Madeline had known. The second will had been drafted, but not filed. Finch had never seen it. Madeline, however, had. He returned to Madeline that night. "You were calm at the funeral," Poirot said softly. She looked at him. "Should I have fallen to pieces? Is that what society demands?" Poirot stepped forward. Society demands nothing but guilt. It is a heavier burden than grief, and you, madame, carry it well." She said nothing. Poirot placed the second will on the table. "You knew, and you acted before it could be filed. A small dose of belladonna in his evening water. Enough to silence him, to preserve your inheritance, to erase Eleanor Weatherby once and for all." Her mask cracked, only slightly. "She was going to destroy everything. Everything I built." Poirot leaned closer. "No, madame. You destroyed it yourself. By Act 3, the truth was undeniable." Poirot presented the evidence before Japp and Finch. The apothecary's account, the false migraine excuse, the residue in the water glass, the torn letter, the new will. Every thread led to Madeleine, but still, no confession came. She was arrested quietly the next morning, escorted without handcuffs, her chin lifted like royalty. As the carriage rolled away, Poirot stood in the doorway of the estate, watching the widow, who never cried, finally vanish into the distance. Japp asked, "Do you think she'll ever shed a tear?" Poirot was quiet. Then he said, "Tears are not proof of sorrow, mon ami, but silence, silence can be proof of guilt." He turned, his gaze lingering on the empty chair in the study, the faint scent of ink and betrayal still hanging in the air. "She did not kill for passion," Poirot whispered to himself. "She killed for preservation. And such motives, they bloom in gardens far colder than love." Chapter 7. The locked greenhouse door. The key was still in the lock, on the inside. The greenhouse door stood sealed behind its pane of fogged glass, cold and breathless in the morning light. And inside, barely visible through the condensation, was a hand, pale, slack, lifeless, pressed against the glass as if it had reached for freedom too late. The air outside smelled of soil and rain, but beneath it lingered something far sharper, a faint trace of sulfur and decay carried by the wind like a warning. Poirot arrived at Briarcliff's greenhouse moments after the maid's scream echoed across the lawn. The groundskeeper, already white with panic, was tugging helplessly at the door handle. "Locked from within," he said, sweat beading on his forehead. "No way to get in." "Ah," Poirot replied softly, stepping forward, "but the one inside, they did not intend to come out." It took 3 minutes to break the glass. The door gave way with a sharp crack, and the scent of death rushed out like breath from a coffin. Inside, sprawled among the orchids, was the lifeless body of Dr. Ambrose Denham, a visiting botanist, a friend of the late Lady Emilienne, and a man whose curiosity had always outweighed his caution. His spectacles lay shattered beside a tipped-over stool, his face twisted into a final, grotesque rictus of shock. His hand, yes, the one against the glass, had 3 distinct welts along the fingers, raised and blistered. Nearby, a small vial lay, broken on the floor. It had no label. Poirot knelt beside the body, narrowing his eyes as he reached for a nearby potting glove. With it, he picked up the shard of the vial and examined the liquid that had dried to a faint yellow smear across the tiles. "No ordinary poison," he murmured. "This was designed to be something more." He stood slowly. "Monsieur Japp," he said, turning to the inspector, who had just arrived, "we are not dealing with an accident. This man was murdered." Act 1 unfolded with chilling precision. Dr. Denham had arrived at the estate 2 days prior, invited by Lydia Vale under the pretense of cataloguing a rare species of rose recently unearthed from the old orchard. He had dined with the remaining guests, Isadora Venn, Miles Hargrave, and Lydia herself, and had made no secret of his suspicion that something unnatural was growing on these grounds. "There are roots beneath Briarcliff," he had said at supper, "that were not planted by man." It was dismissed as eccentricity. Now Poirot knew it had been foreshadowing. The greenhouse had only one key. It belonged to Isidora, who had not entered the building in over a week, claiming she had taken ill and was keeping to her rooms. But Poirot knew better. She had lied before, and the scent of the vial, acidic, metallic, reminded him of something she had once brewed. A tonic, she said, for muscle spasms, but he had seen the side effects before, in Cairo, in a case long buried, an obscure poison derived from the Nerium oleander, untraceable if administered in vapor form, and fatal within 5 minutes. Poirot turned his attention to the door frame. There, etched faintly into the wood, was a partial fingerprint, smudged, but large, too large for Isidora, possibly male. Miles, then. Miles claimed he had been riding that morning. No one had seen him leave, and no stable hand remembered saddling his horse. Poirot questioned him directly over brandy. "You disliked Dr. Denham, did you not?" Miles raised an eyebrow. "Disliked? I barely knew the man." "But you knew he was researching Emilienne's estate records, that he requested access to the property deeds, that he asked questions about land ownership." Miles smiled without warmth. "And you think that's motive for murder?" Poirot tilted his head. "Monsieur, I do not think anything yet. But I find it most curious that you gave him access to the West Garden, but not the chapel grounds." Miles's fingers twitched. Act 2 unraveled quickly. In Denham's room, Poirot found a half-written letter, addressed to a colleague at Kew Gardens. It read, "Have confirmed suspicions. Briarcliff's botanical records falsified. Rose Hargrave was not bred here. Origin linked to French estate. Possible theft of specimen. Evidence in greenhouse. But the widow knows more than she admits. Tomorrow I will—" The letter stopped there. Poirot read it twice. "Tomorrow I will die," he whispered to himself. The Rose Hargrave, the rare flower Emilienne had claimed as her horticultural legacy, was the root of this. A lie. A theft, perhaps. But more than that, a secret someone had killed to protect. The second twist arrived in the form of an old estate ledger, tucked behind a broken piano in the storage wing. Poirot had been searching for something, anything, to verify Denham's claim. What he found was far worse. An entry, dated 12 years ago. Shipment received from Marseille. 4 cuttings, hybrid strain, no record filed under Hargrave name. To be marked as property of Ven Isidora, not Emilienne. She had bred the rose. She had brought the cuttings from France. Emilienne had stolen the credit and the profits, and Denham had discovered it. Poirot confronted her the next morning, in the sunroom where she sat sipping bitter tea, her eyes hollow. "He was going to publish," she whispered. "Everything." "And so you killed him?" Poirot asked. Her silence was not denial, but something colder. Resignation. "No," she said finally. "I wanted to, but I didn't." He leaned forward. "Then who?" She looked at him. "You already know." He did. Poirot called them all to the greenhouse that evening. The storm outside raged with cinematic cruelty, lightning illuminating the twisted shadows of orchids and thorny stems. Candles flickered along the glass walls as the last act began. "There was only one way to lock the greenhouse from inside," Poirot said calmly, "and that is by entering from within the passage that connects to the root cellar a passage sealed for years. But recently, someone cleared it. Someone who had reason to kill, not just to protect a secret, but to protect a lie. He turned to Lydia Vale. "You brought Dr. Denham here," he said. "You knew what he'd find, but you did not expect him to find the ledger. You were afraid he would destroy everything Emilienne built, and you, who adored her, could not allow that." Lydia's eyes widened. "I didn't poison him," she whispered. "No," Poirot agreed. "You only trapped him. You left the key in the door, yes, but you locked the outer passage when he went inside. You thought he'd fall ill. You thought it would delay him. But he found the vial, and he broke it, and the vapor did the rest." She shook her head. "I just wanted time." Poirot closed his eyes. "Time is the one thing the dead cannot grant, mademoiselle." Japp stepped forward. Lydia did not resist. Poirot watched as she was led into the storm. Then he turned back toward the empty greenhouse, now washed with pale moonlight. A single rose sat blooming near the center, untouched. "The truth," Poirot whispered, "grows even in locked places. You may trap a man, but never a lie." And he turned away as the wind rattled the glass and the dead leaves curled quietly against the frame. Chapter 8. Her alibi was too perfect. The clock struck 11. Precisely as the scream echoed from the east corridor, a sharp, guttural sound that cut the night like a blade. The guests were still seated in the drawing room, sipping cordials and listening to the storm tap gently against the stained glass windows. But the moment the cry pierced through the candlelit hush, every glass stilled mid-air, and every eye turned toward the shadows at the hall. Seconds later, the butler, his face bloodless and his voice shaking, whispered the word that pulled all warmth from the room. "There's been another death." Poirot was the first to rise. Even before reaching the threshold of the corridor, he knew. He could feel it in the air, the stillness, the panic, the echo of something staged. And when he reached the guest bedroom door and saw the limp form of Evelyn Ashcroft collapsed against the writing desk, her wrist bent unnaturally, a smear of ink across her hand, and a shard of broken glass by her elbow, he didn't rush. Instead, he stopped, observed, and whispered to himself, but there are no coincidences in a house this frightened." Evelyn was not dead. Not yet. A pulse fluttered beneath her throat. Barely. Japp arrived moments later, his raincoat dripping, his tone already sharp with suspicion. "Poisoned," he said after a swift examination. "Ink bottle was laced. Attempted suicide. Probably guilt." "Non, mon ami," Poirot said quietly. "This was not a suicide. This was theatre." The bottle, upon closer inspection, bore faint traces of powdered strychnine, enough to paralyze, not kill. And the note Evelyn had begun to write, never finished, read only, "I was never meant to be part of—" The dash ended mid-curve, as if her hand had been forced to stop. Poirot turned to the gathering crowd. Most had witnessed Evelyn's arrival only 2 days prior. A cousin of Lady Emilienne, though the exact relation was nebulous. She had arrived, unannounced, with luggage monogrammed E.A., and the sort of charm that required no explanation. In her mid-30s, with auburn hair pinned with military precision and gloves stitched in Paris, Evelyn had quickly woven herself into the house like ivy around an old stone. The mystery of the attack on her demanded answers, but Poirot's attention was already drifting elsewhere, to her alibi. When asked where she had been during the hours leading up to the incident, she answered smoothly, "In the West Conservatory, alone, reading." A perfect alibi, too perfect. Poirot knew the conservatory had a flaw. One pane of its domed glass ceiling had cracked during the last storm and had been boarded up. Any visitor would have commented on the chill, but Evelyn did not, nor did her shoes show signs of dew or soil. She had changed them. He saw her boots neatly lined by the hearth, a fire freshly stoked, not 2 hours old. By mid-morning, the next day, Act Two had begun. The question was no longer whether Evelyn was the victim. It was whether she was the architect. Poirot began reassembling the puzzle with the calm of a man trimming hedges. Each fragment fit only when viewed through the lens of deception. 3 days earlier, Gerald Finch, the solicitor, had privately informed Poirot that someone had forged Lady Emily's signature on a codicil to her will. The document was dated 6 months before her death and named Evelyn Ashcroft as sole inheritor of the Rose Hargrave hybrid, a flower now believed to be worth tens of thousands in botanical circles. That's quite a leap of generosity for a cousin she hadn't seen in years, Finch had muttered, folding the paper, or perhaps a reward for silence. Poirot had studied the signature. To the untrained eye, flawless. To Poirot, impossibly perfect. No hesitation, no variance. As though traced, Poirot invited Evelyn for tea. She accepted, of course. Her smile was crisp, her voice velvet. "You enjoy puzzles, mademoiselle?" he asked lightly, offering her a scone. "I solve them for breakfast," she replied. "And yet," he said, "I find the most elegant puzzles are often those that pretend not to be puzzles at all. Like, for example, the way a lady arrives uninvited to a manor house days before a death, claims kinship none can verify, produces a forged document, and then arranges a staged poisoning of herself." She blinked once. Slowly. "I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot," he smiled. "I am not implying, madame. I am declaring." But she did not break. Instead, she doubled down. "If I were guilty," she said, leaning forward, "wouldn't I have ensured the poison worked?" Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Ah, but you see, that is the brilliance of your performance. You crafted an alibi so perfect it drew no breath. You made yourself the victim of a crime you orchestrated, so that no one would question you as the villain of another." By evening the storm returned, rattling the glass and shaking the trees outside. Poirot walked the corridor alone, stopping at each door, each corner, as if listening to the house whisper its secrets. It was then he noticed a photograph, one tucked behind a mirror in the hallway, near Evelyn's quarters. It had fallen slightly. He straightened it. Lady Emilienne, a younger version, standing beside a woman who bore Evelyn's eyes, but not Evelyn's face. And on the back, scribbled in fading ink, "To my beloved sister, Agatha." Not a cousin, a daughter. Evelyn was not family by blood, but by birthright. Hidden, perhaps disowned, perhaps concealed in scandal, and now returned to claim what she believed was hers. Poirot summoned everyone to the great room for the final act. The fire cracked. Candlelight flickered on the glass dome above. Evelyn stood by the piano, composed, the light catching the brooch at her throat, a rose, carved from jet. "I have solved your mystery," Poirot announced. There was no sound but the ticking of the long case clock. "This was never about inheritance," Poirot continued. "It was about revenge." He turned to Evelyn. "You knew Emilienne had stolen your mother's creation, the Rose Hargrave. You knew she had hidden your lineage, hidden you. But when you arrived here, you didn't come as a thief. You came as justice. Evelyn's face was unreadable. You forged the will, not to gain riches, but to provoke suspicion, to invite scrutiny. You staged the poisoning to draw eyes, all so that someone, anyone, would begin asking questions about the rose, about the past, about who you truly were. A beat. And it worked. She smiled, just barely. Poirot stepped closer. But what you did not anticipate was this. In creating the perfect alibi, you became the most suspicious person in the house. Because perfection, madame, is unnatural. Evelyn's gaze met his. So what now? You will be arrested, Poirot said quietly. Not for murder, but for fraud, and for the crimes of silence you perpetuated. Truth, madame, is not justice. Justice is truth brought to light. As Japp stepped forward, Evelyn raised her chin. Then let the light burn everything. Poirot stood alone after they were gone. The fire was low, the room hollow. He whispered, almost to himself, a perfect alibi is like a perfect flower. Beautiful, but never natural. It always comes from a root, soaked in something darker. And as the last flame flickered and died, he turned from the window into the darkness where answers always waited. Chapter 9. The secret buried in roots. The shovel struck something that was not earth. A hollow clink, soft and metallic, muffled beneath layers of moss and tangled roots. The groundskeeper froze, his breath visible in the cold morning air, and called out without moving. When Poirot arrived minutes later, the soil had already been cleared enough to reveal the top of a rusted tin box, no larger than a loaf of bread. Its edges were lined with corrosion, but the lock, though old, had not been broken. Inside the box, beneath a folded cloth of disintegrating velvet, was a single locket, a child's lace glove, and a sealed envelope with one word written across it: confession. Poirot stood over the box for a long moment without speaking. The roots of the old rosebush curled around the tin like fingers refusing to let go. Ah, he said softly, it is always the garden that remembers, even when everyone else forgets. The location was not random. It was the farthest corner of the orchard, where the original Rose-Hargrave hybrid had first been cultivated. Now overgrown, it was a place few visited, and fewer still knew the significance of, but Poirot had known to look there, not from a clue in handwriting or an overheard whisper, but from something far more human: guilt. Lydia Vale had avoided that side of the grounds during every morning walk. She had once mentioned it had poor soil. But that morning, Poirot had seen her pause and stare at the twisted old bush for just a second too long. And so, the digging had begun. The envelope in the box was addressed not to anyone in particular, but the writing was unmistakably that of Lady Emilienne Hargrave. Poirot opened it delicately. The ink had faded, but the contents were sharp enough to cut through bone. There was a child. She did not live long, the result of a choice made in silence, concealed in shame. I buried the glove with her. I buried the name. If anyone ever finds this, I beg them to understand, what I did was not cruelty. It was desperation. Poirot's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes grew still. Later that morning, in the drawing room filled with the scent of dying roses and rain on glass, he gathered the usual suspects. The fire flickered against the decanters, casting long shadows across the oriental rug. Isidora Venn, stiff-backed and silent, watched Poirot with something unreadable in her eyes. She had grown quieter, with each passing day, as if the walls were closing in. Miles Hargrave stood by the sideboard, drink in hand, mouth tight. His arrogance had begun to fray at the edges. His inheritance had been threatened too many times, his motives questioned too often. Lydia Vale sat near the window, hands folded in her lap. She had said little since the incident with Evelyn, but Poirot had watched the way her fingers curled every time the name Emilienne was mentioned. Not reverence, not grief, resentment. Poirot did not begin with accusation. Instead, he asked a question. Who remembers the name Beatrice? The room fell silent. Isadora's brow furrowed. Miles said nothing, but Lydia paled. Poirot nodded to himself. Yes, it is a name no longer spoken, but once it belonged to a child. He stepped toward the hearth, producing the locket from the box. Inside was a faded photograph. Emilienne holding a small girl with curls too golden to be her own. She was buried, not in a grave, Poirot said softly, but beneath the soil of a rose garden. And with her, Emilienne buried her shame and a secret. He turned to Isadora. You were there when she died, n'est-ce pas? Isadora's lips parted, but no sound came. You administered something, Poirot continued. A sedative. The child was ill, but the dose was too strong. Isadora shook her head. No, I warned her. I told her Beatrice was too young, but she insisted it was only to help her sleep. And yet, Poirot said, voice still calm, the child did not wake. You helped bury her. You helped write the lie. He let that sink in, before turning to Miles. You found out years later, did you not? That Emilienne had once had a daughter, that she had buried her in secret. And you used this knowledge not to bring justice, but to control the narrative. You blackmailed her, subtly, politely, but effectively. Miles's eyes darkened. What proof do you have? Ah, Poirot said, producing a second letter. This one, written by Emilienne, and never sent. In it, she speaks of your threats. How you demanded partial ownership of the Rose Hargrave claim in exchange for silence. You were bleeding her dry, Monsieur Hargrave. Slowly, strategically. Miles said nothing, but his hands tightened on the glass. And then Poirot turned to Lydia. You, mademoiselle, are the missing piece. You who catalogued every flower, every letter. You who knew of the original shipment from France, cuttings marked not for Emilienne, but for someone else. A woman named Beatrice Venn, a cousin of Emilienne's, a botanist, and your mother. Gasps broke the silence. Poirot nodded. Yes, you were the child who survived, not the Beatrice who died. That was the lie. Emilienne stole your mother's work, took credit for the rose, and when your mother protested, she disappeared. Lydia's voice was barely audible. She was never found. I was raised by strangers. You came back, Poirot said, to find answers. To reclaim a legacy, you changed your name. You gained Emilienne's trust. But when Denham began digging too deep, when Evelyn arrived with forged documents, when too many people threatened to uncover the truth, you panicked. No, Lydia whispered. I didn't kill them. Poirot studied her face. No, but you staged the poisoning. You helped others protect the lie, and in doing so, you became part of the very crime you were trying to expose. He turned slowly to the fire. The death of Beatrice Venn was no accident, and the burial was not out of love. It was erasure. But secrets, mes amis, they are like roots. Bury them, and they only grow deeper. Jap entered then, with officers in tow. Isadora was taken into custody for the death of the child, unintentional perhaps, but concealed for decades. Miles would face charges of blackmail and fraud. Lydia would not be arrested, but her life would never return to what it was. As the room emptied, Poirot remained by the fire. Rain lashed against the windows now. The garden outside was dark, wet, and whispering. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the child's glove. A single glove, he said to himself, buried with a truth too painful to speak. And yet, it was not the glove that solved the mystery. It was the silence around it. He looked out at the garden. Roots do not forget, he murmured. And the earth, mon cher Hastings, it never lies. And then he turned from the window, his silhouette vanishing into the shadows of the hall where no flower could grow without remembering. Chapter 10. The bloom that shouldn't exist. The flower was not supposed to bloom in winter, and yet there it was, at the heart of the garden where the snow lay untouched, a single violet-black rose, blooming defiantly through the frost. Its petals curled like whispers and bled a hue not known to any natural strain. The air around it was deathly still, the frost melting around its roots in a perfect circle. Lydia Vale had found it first, her gloved hand recoiling the instant she touched it. Poirot arrived minutes later, summoned not by alarm, but by the unshakable pull of something wrong. He stared at the rose for a long moment before speaking. "This," he said softly, "is no act of nature. This is an announcement." He knelt carefully, his breath rising in the morning air. The stem bore no thorns. The soil beneath it had been loosened recently, disturbed with purpose. Nearby, the remnants of a small brass plaque lay buried beneath the mulch. Poirot lifted it. Gently, the inscription, barely visible through the tarnish, read, "Hargrave number 1, failed trial." Failed, and yet here it was, blooming. Act 1 began with the removal of the rose under sealed glass, escorted by Poirot himself to the study. He summoned the household that evening, the atmosphere thick with dread and rain tapping gently against the window panes. The same people returned to the drawing-room chairs like characters in a tragedy too rehearsed to be coincidence. Lydia Vale, haunted but calm. Isadora Venn, clenched behind her shawl, and Miles Hargrave, his eyes always 2 seconds ahead of the conversation. "None of you," Poirot said, "are strangers to the secrets of this house. But today we are not investigating a murder. We are investigating a resurrection. The flower, as it turned out, should never have existed. According to the estate's botanical records, the Hargrave number, one strain, had been destroyed 13 years ago after its unstable genetics caused a bloom to rot from within days. It had not survived, so claimed Emilienne in her journals, so recorded by Isadora in the greenhouse logs. But this one was alive, and fresh, and recently planted. Someone wanted it seen," Poirot said quietly. "Not preserved, not hidden, seen." He began by asking the obvious. Who had been in the garden the previous night? Isadora claimed illness. Lydia had been cataloguing archives. Miles had been writing letters, or so he said. No one had seen him post them. Poirot did not believe a single word. Then the first twist arrived, unexpected and brutal. The groundskeeper's dog unearthed a skeleton behind the greenhouse, its bones tangled with roots and cloth. The remains were female, adult, and not old, no more than 15 years in the ground. The identity was confirmed within hours. Beatrice Venn, the original botanist and Isadora's sister, long thought to have fled to France after a falling out with Emilienne. Poirot did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the fire, reading Beatrice's last remaining letter. It had been tucked into the back of a ledger, long forgotten. The ink was faded, but the words were sharp. I will not let her steal this bloom. It is not hers. It was never hers. I buried the strain where no one would find it. No one except the child who bears my name. If she blooms it, the house will fall. Poirot closed his eyes. Then this rose, he whispered, is not a miracle. It is a curse, blooming exactly as intended. Act 2 bled into suspicion. Lydia, now confirmed as Beatrice's daughter, admitted she had known of her mother's death, but not of the location. She vanished, Lydia whispered. I thought she had left me behind, but Emilienne, she must have had her killed. Isadora denied involvement. I loved my sister, she said, but she was unstable. She thought the rose could cure disease. She became obsessed. And so you buried her, Poirot murmured. I buried her memory, Isadora snapped, not her body. Then came the second twist. Poirot discovered a hidden drawer in Emilienne's writing desk. Inside were 3 vials of dried black petals, sealed and labeled. Hargrave number 1. Samples, preserved. And a letter, addressed to Miles. If the child ever returns, do not let her bloom it. The roots are too deep and the truth too near. Poirot now understood everything. That night, as the storm reached its peak and the lightning backlit the trees like charred veins, Poirot gathered them once more. You each played your part, he began, but none more than Miles. Miles stood, arms folded. You're wasting time. You forged the permits to bury the garden plot, Poirot said. You altered the greenhouse logs. You did not want the Hargrave number. 1 destroyed. You wanted it suppressed. Until now. What are you saying? You planted the bloom. Days ago, in secret, to trigger chaos, to force Lydia's hand, and in doing so, you revealed the body. He turned to Lydia. You found the flower. Not by chance, by memory. You remembered where your mother used to walk. You knew the root system. You saw her ghost in every petal. He faced Isadora last. And you knew she never left. Isadora wept, then, not loud, not dramatic, but slow, ragged sobs that tore at the air. She died, protecting that flower, Isadora whispered, because it proved Emilienne was a thief, because it proved everything was stolen. Poirot lowered his voice. But you let them bury her, to protect the legacy. No, she whispered, to protect Lydia. There it was, the final betrayal. Poirot closed the box around the bloom. You buried the past, he said softly, but it refused to stay dead. Because some truths, like this flower, bloom only when the ground is disturbed. Jap entered to escort Miles away. His crimes, fraud, tampering, conspiracy, were enough. But the real crime Poirot knew was the one committed by everyone: silence. As the room emptied, Poirot stood alone, with the glass dome and the impossible flower inside. It is a beautiful thing, he said quietly, but unnatural, like so many lies. And as the candle guttered out and the storm began to fade, the petals shimmered once more, alive, defiant, and whispering all the things the dead could no longer say. Chapter 11. Petals found in his pocket. He had been dead for less than an hour, but already the petals had begun to wilt. They were found in his waistcoat pocket, 4 delicate bruised rose petals, their edges curling, the color a dusky crimson with faint black veins. They were not the kind of petals one might collect for sentiment. No perfume lingered on them. They had been torn, not plucked, and the manner in which they were folded into his pocket, deliberate, hidden, spoke not of love, but of warning. Hercule Poirot, standing over the body of the estate's librarian, Mr. Caspar Dane, said nothing for a long while. Then, with great calm, he bent down, plucked one petal between 2 gloved fingers, and whispered to himself, "Ah, there is always a message, even in a whisper from the dead." Caspar Dane was not well liked, nor truly known. He had been hired by Lady Emilienne to oversee the estate's extensive private archives shortly before her death, and he had remained, after, in a dusty corner of Briarcliff Hall that few visited. Quiet, bookish, and with a stare that seemed to pierce even closed doors, Caspar had no family, no background of note. He was a man of records and order, nothing more. So when the housemaid found him slumped against the fire grate in the library, neck bruised, his spectacles askew, a single brass bookend lying beside him, the assumption was robbery. But Poirot saw otherwise. The lock to the archive room had not been tampered with. Nothing had been taken. The ledgers were all accounted for. And yet, someone had gone through great trouble to make it appear otherwise. Act 1 began not with the body, but with the petals. Poirot laid them gently across a silk cloth in the study, each examined under magnification. They were not from the common Hargrave roses that grew in the western gardens. These petals bore a darker pigment, almost unnatural. And then Poirot remembered the failed Hargrave number 2 hybrid, a strain so volatile it had wilted before full bloom. It had never been allowed to propagate. According to the records, the entire batch had been burned. And yet, here it was, 4 petals from a rose that no longer existed. Isidora then, when questioned, claimed she had disposed of the no. 2 hybrid herself. The roots were too aggressive, she said. It overwhelmed every other plant. Emilienne ordered it destroyed. Yet someone, Poirot replied calmly, had the foresight to preserve its bloom, or its memory. Miles Hargrave scoffed at the idea that a man would be murdered over a flower. Perhaps Dane found something in the records, something about the inheritance, or the land ownership. Flowers don't kill people, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot turned, sharp-eyed. Non, monsieur, but secrets do. And the petals? They were left for me to find. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a challenge. Lydia Vale was the last to speak that day. She admitted that Dane had approached her 3 days prior with questions about the 1912 land acquisition, specifically a missing map detailing an underground irrigation system beneath the east wing of the gardens. He was obsessed with finding something, she said. Kept talking about roots, not just literal ones. He said Lady Emilienne had buried more than roses in this house. Poirot knew then that this murder, unlike the others, was not a cover-up. It was a discovery someone could not afford to let stand. Act 2 unfolded beneath the floorboards. Poirot returned to the archive room after midnight, accompanied only by candlelight and silence. He began moving each book from the central shelf, the one Dane had been organizing the day before his death. Behind the final ledger, he found what Dane had found, a rolled vellum map, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. The wax bore the sigil of Emilienne Hargrave's father, the original landowner. When unrolled, the map revealed the irrigation layout beneath the gardens. But more striking than that was what had been added in ink, an X marked beneath the East Conservatory, accompanied by a phrase in Latin, in radicibus veritas jacet. In the roots, the truth lies. Poirot did not sleep. The next day, with the quiet help of 2 constables, he had the floor beneath the East Conservatory carefully lifted. Below, a root system had indeed grown into a mass, gnarled, dense, and ancient. At its center, partially consumed by time and rot, was a metal lockbox. Inside were 5 documents. Each one was a confession. Letters written not by Emilienne, but by Beatrice Venn. They told a story Poirot had only suspected. Beatrice had not merely bred the Hargrave roses. She had discovered something else, a chemical compound in the petals that, when refined, could be used medicinally or as a slow poison. The early strains had been too unstable, but the number 2 hybrid, the one supposedly destroyed, had shown promise. Emilienne had seen potential. She had stolen it, experimented with it, even used it on one of her rivals. And Beatrice, horrified, had threatened to go public. She vanished days later. Poirot now understood what Dane had discovered and why he was killed. Act 3 began with rain. It always seemed to rain when Poirot was near the end of something. As he stood before the hearth, the household gathered in uneasy silence. He held the petals in one hand and the letters in the other. The petals, he said, were a message, but not from the killer, from the victim. Caspar Dane knew he would not live. He left the clue for me. Isadora's hands clenched. That's absurd. Non, madame, Poirot said. What is absurd is the coincidence that a flower which no longer exists appears in the pocket of a murdered man, unless that man had found the flower, or its source. He turned to Miles. You were right about one thing. This was not about money. It was about control. The one thing that all of you desire, but none of you possess, except perhaps you, madame. He looked directly at Lydia Vale. You knew about the documents. You helped Dane translate them, but you did not expect him to act so quickly. You feared he would release them without you. And so, when he asked to meet in the library, alone, you went first. You struck him. You left the petals, knowing I would follow them. But what you did not know was that he had already mailed copies. Lydia said nothing. Poirot placed the petals back into their cloth. You were trying to honor your mother, but you became what you hated, a thief of truth. Jap entered as Lydia rose without protest. As she was taken away, Poirot stood by the fireplace, gazing at the final letter in the box. One written not to anyone in particular, but signed, Let my roots be my legacy. B.V. He spoke aloud to the empty room. There are those who hide their sins beneath the soil, but the earth, it is honest. It cannot forget. It nourishes everything we bury. And as the fire crackled, the petals finally crumbled into ash. No longer evidence, but memory. Chapter 12. The thorn that solved everything. The thorn was wedged between his ribs, small, cruel, and almost invisible in the gloom. The body was discovered in the West Conservatory, where the final rain of the season had stained the glass ceiling with streaks of dirt and memory. Caspar Dane's replacement, a young man named Ellis, had entered to organize a shipment of botanical samples and instead found Gerald Finch, the estate's solicitor, slumped over the wrought iron bench beside the Hargrave rose trellis. At first glance, it appeared natural, a man overcome by strain, perhaps a heart attack. But then the blood was noticed, a slow, dark stream, barely trickling from beneath his waistcoat. And in the very center of it all, buried just deep enough to hide from sight, was a rose thorn. Not just any thorn. A single, sharpened fragment carved from the infamous Hargrave number. 2 hybrid, dried and lacquered, its tip coated with a faint black sheen. Poirot removed it with a pair of tweezers, his expression unreadable. The thorn was no accident. It had been prepared with care. It was a murder weapon designed to look like coincidence. Clever, Poirot murmured, examining the wound as if reading the last chapter of a book. But it is always the flourish, the vanity, that betrays the killer. And this is not a crime of passion. This is the final act of a performance. Finch had never been widely liked at Briarcliff Hall. He was sharp, discreet, and deeply loyal to Lady Emilienne, some said obsessively so. He handled her will, her estate finances, and more importantly, her secrets. And now he was dead, within reach of the very rose that began this entire saga. Act 1 unfolded like the slow peeling of a scab. Japp arrived on the scene and immediately suspected Lydia Vale. Her connection to the Hargrave roses, her forged documents, and her involvement in the previous deceptions made her an obvious suspect. But Poirot dismissed the theory. Lydia had fled Briarcliff the day before. Her name cleared, but her conscience fractured. She had not returned. That left only 3 remaining suspects. Isadora Venn, who had grown increasingly reclusive, now spending most of her time in the East Wing with her tinctures and vials. Miles Hargrave, whose arrogance had curdled into quiet desperation as the weight of the estate's collapse closed in. And Ellis, the young assistant with too many questions and no documented past. Poirot began with Isadora. "You knew Finch better than anyone," he said. "He trusted you. You shared a loyalty to Emilienne, and yet you let him die." Isadora's eyes flicked to the rose thorn on Poirot's desk. "He betrayed her," she said after a long silence. "He made promises after her death that he did not keep. He was trying to sell the rose patent overseas." Poirot leaned forward. "And you stopped him?" She shook her head. "No, but I wanted to." Poirot believed her. Not because of her words, but because of her timing. Isadora, for all her flaws, had never been a killer. She lacked the precision, but someone else did. The real twist came in the form of a misplaced journal. Finch's own, discovered beneath the floorboard of his study, hidden in a compartment that no one would have noticed, except for Poirot. Inside were pages of careful entries, each one chronicling Emilienne's rise to fame and the great lie surrounding the Hargrave roses. But there was something more. "The thorn is the truth," one entry read, "hidden in the bloom. Beatrice's research proved it could both kill and cure. Emilienne never destroyed the strain. She kept it, locked away. I alone know where it's buried." Poirot's eyes narrowed. He turned the page. A map, sketched roughly, showed the greenhouse, the conservatory, and beneath it, the forgotten root vault, a subterranean chamber once used for storing bulbs during the cold season. Sealed off, decades ago, that was where the final piece lay hidden. Act 2 began with a shovel. Poirot descended into the root vault that evening with Japp and 2 constables. The chamber smelled of rot and iron. And there, behind a false wall of stacked clay pots, they found it, a glass case. Inside, perfectly preserved, were 4 vials, each labeled with Beatrice Ven's initials, and beside them a packet of seeds and a letter addressed to Finch. The letter, penned in Emilienne's hand, revealed the truth. If this reaches you, Gerald, it means I have failed to keep the past buried. You must protect the legacy, burn the seeds, hide the research. If the thorn is ever used, it will lead back to me. Beatrice warned me, and I silenced her. Do not let her prophecy come true. Prophecy, the thorn that could both kill and cure. Beatrice's final experiment. Poirot returned to the study that night, the thorn glinting under lamplight. He called the suspects in for the final time. I have found the chamber, he said. The thorn was not merely a symbol, it was the key to everything, a weapon and a signature. Finch knew it. He planned to sell it. He betrayed Emilienne's wishes. He turned to Ellis. You were not hired by Finch. You were never sent by the Botanical Institute. You forged your letters. Ellis blinked. That's absurd. No, Poirot said. What is absurd is your handwriting. It matches the labels in the vault. You are Beatrice's son. The last piece of the puzzle. Gasps filled the room. You came to Briarcliff not to study, but to reclaim. You found Finch's journal. You confronted him. And when he refused to give up the formula, you used the very weapon he tried to sell. Ellis stood slowly. He was going to make a fortune. He didn't care what it was built on. My mother, she died for that rose. Poirot nodded. Yes. But now, so did he. Japp stepped forward. Ellis did not resist. Poirot walked them out, then remained by the window, watching the wind toss dead petals across the lawn. It was over. But the thorns remained. He whispered, It is always the thorn, Hastings. Not the bloom. The thorn reveals what the flower hides. And as the candle guttered out, the garden outside stood silent once more, holding in its roots all the secrets that had finally come to light.